Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Miguel Perez. I'm the head of public programming for the Phillips collection, and I'm really just here to lay a couple ground rules. Tonight, obviously, we are here welcoming Marley Dawson from Australia, where he lives and works. Unfortunately, not able to come into the not able to leave the country yet and come and visit us. But thankfully, Vesela Stretenović, who is our curator of modern and contemporary art at the Phillips collection, is live from the museum, and you can see Marley's installation there behind her. So that'll be really great for us to have as a background for this evening. For tonight, if you have any questions, please submit them through the chat or Q&A, and we will address those in the last 15 minutes of the program. That's really all I have to say tonight. I'm going to turn it over to Vesela, who's going to kick it off for us. Vesela?
Thank you, Miguel, and thank you everybody who joined us tonight, 6 o'clock here. I came to the museum to be Marley, who couldn't make it. I'm his ghost, and the project title is Ghost. I'm just the one single ghost, and what you see behind is his wonderful work that we installed on Zoom this week. Marley Dawson is somebody who I've met 5, 6, 7 years ago while he and his wife Bree lived in Washington, D.C. And that's really when the project started to percolate. Often it takes a long time. I'm sorry you hear sounds. People are leaving the museum, but bear with us. It takes always more than you think to make something to free tradition and to make something happen. And Marley is our 29th intersection, which started in 2009. It's kind of hard to believe it's the 29th. It was supposed to happen last year in the fall, but given the COVID and everything else, we all had to push back. And here we are, not that much longer, 6 months later, welcoming Marley via Zoom to be here and to be with us. So Marley Dawson, thank you for joining us from your studio in Bentaga. And I will start this presentation. Here's a slide of which you see suspended chairs, 5 chairs suspended, and some things on the landing in the Go Annex for you guys who have been to the Phillips many times. But before we hear Marley, and more about the project, I want to thank many people. University of Maryland, with whom we present the series of intersections, but more than everybody else, Australian Council for the Arts that really helps support the production of the work, and Embassy of Australia here, and specifically Laura Nix, who really was behind this project from the beginning. I also want to thank all of my colleagues and who helped this project being realized, and say that Marley's work is not only at the Phillips, but will be concurrently showed at the Hemphill Gallery here in Washington, D.C., and soon installed at the Embassy, and will be there for a year. We do hope to have Marley at some point leaving Australia, joining us for in-person events, but until then, we'll live on a planet Zoom. With that, here is Marley. I'm going to turn it over to Marley, but he's in Australia in Bentaga, which is the place in Victoria, 250 miles northeast from Melbourne?
Yeah.
Right?
My metric to imperial conversions have gone out the window, but I'm guessing like 180 miles northeast of Melbourne and like 300 miles southwest of Sydney, so right on a border. It's a First Nations word, and it's Bethanga.
Sorry if my pronunciation. Haven't visited you yet.
It's a hard one. No, it's a small regional town. We have a little property out here, out of town. We're about half an hour drive from my wife's work, but we live out here with this small person that lives with us all the time, and it's been pretty good.
Yes. So just wanted to, and what is the time difference? What time is it over there now?
It has just gone 8 a.m., 8:06.
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
With that, Marley, let's start talking about your work and the beginning of the project, again called Ghosts. Take it from here. The screen is yours.
So, okay. So I think maybe the starting point, and Vesela, please jump in at any point. Intersections when we started talking about it, I looked at the kind of history of the project and where the project kind of sits within the museum, about that it interacts and intersects with either the collection or the architecture or the museum itself. And I know a lot of the other projects have been look at a particular work in the collection, one that they kind of focus on, or a body of work, or one of the artists contained in there. And I think I've said this to you privately. The Phillips has many, many amazing paintings. I'm a sculptor, and the holding of the Phillips in sculpture is not so extensive. And so going through the collection, I was kind of awed by everything. Nothing I could really sink my teeth into, or that sort of feeling. So I started thinking about what the Phillips is for me. And I was lucky enough, when we were living in DC, I got a really intimate time with the Phillips. I worked on the preparatory crew there. I helped out a little bit, got to see the collection, not on display, but where it's stored, where it's hung. Worked with some of the living legends that are part of the Phillips and talking about the collection there.
You had a behind
and I started to
insight.
Absolutely. And so I started thinking about, the Phillips to me it's a hybrid, it's a hybrid of the house and a personal collection linked in with a gallery or a museum collection. And they've been smushed together, with the new renovations, but keeping the original house and, the kind of moments of the house that are domestic. And so I kind of thought about what that feeling is, and how to illustrate that, or how to try and highlight that the Phillips is a really unique environment to see work. And those chairs, the kind of, they're quite distinctive chairs. Yeah, these ones that are dotted around the museum, or have been dotted around the museum. I've got friends in DC that when I showed the sketch of the work that I was going to make, they instantly just said that's the Phillips chairs. For me, they're a marker of something that's just part of the museum. It's, it's the infrastructure. It's there. But it's an odd choice for what we know as a white cube sort of space. They're very heavy. They're very decorative. They're incredibly well made. You can see on the left of the image, that's the maker's mark. And then, even small moments of the chair, so this is underneath the cushion. When you pull the cushion off, it's there. But the dowel underneath, how they match the grain in the wood, someone really cared about making these objects. And they were made for, a commission, a specific place. And they're just, to me, they're just part of the Phillips.
We talked a lot about, the memories and recollection and what it means to feel the space. What is the association one has of a space? And you said very clearly, the feeling of the Phillips to you is not so much the collection, but the sense of architecture, domesticity, intimacy, including the chairs and including the stairwell. Yeah. And one thing that I want to say, jump in and say, we made a deal. You said, well, I want to have this space. I want to do some work for this space, for the Go Annex. And I said, well, if you figure out how to suspend things from the ceiling, it's yours. And so some years later, many years later, took a lot of months, a lot of detours, but it's here.
We're here, yeah. And where this is a good spot to jump in with this too. I think a lot of my practice and ongoing practice is, and I've said this to Vesela before, it's making problems. I just make problems for myself, and then the work is figuring it out, the labor of figuring out this problem. And whether that's a, artistic problem or a engineering problem, which, a big conversation about the start of this project was figuring out how to do the hanging. And it was long. It was a long conversation and winding, but I think comes back to a point that I'm trying to embrace more and more in my practice and day to day is if something's impossible, if someone says it's impossible, and if it's impossible because of occupational health and safety hazards or structural things, you need to use the language of occupational health and safety and structural engineering to counter all the points of why it's impossible. And that for me kind of makes for a perverse kind of love of flowcharts and safety manuals, because if you know why you can do things or how to do things safely, it just opens up a huge world of possibilities for me.
But you also told me you really start with an idea or the problem, as you said, that needs a solution.
Yeah.
And with the process and engineering technology and skills that the idea becomes reality, or objectified idea. So there was a lot of those planning and thoughts behind your response to the Phillips furniture, the Phillips architecture, and a work of art, but we'll get to that later. And incredible amount of skills and planning and structural, as I said, engineering that went into this project.
Yeah. And I think maybe, to jump back to the chairs and so if I kind of break it down in a simple way, the problem for this project for me was how to talk about the feeling of the Phillips more than of an object, to talk about that feeling of intimacy that you get to experience work in. The Phillips have a particular aura, and it has a particular smell. It has, there's things that are so distinctive about, for me, going to the Phillips. I've never been in a museum that has those little markers that if you slow down and stop and kind of feel, you can appreciate them for their quirkiness.
And just to give a little bit of historical context, that these chairs that we have actually are a replica of the chairs from turn of the century that are sort of under the umbrella of arts and crafts movements. And there was a particular brand of Flail brothers who did chairs like this that a colleague of mine told me about and pointed me to research. And also they're close to the Joseph Hoffman's chairs, who is one of the founders of Vienna secessions from the turn of the century. But what we have are replicas of those turn of the century chairs. And just like our railing of the stairwell is replica of an earlier period. And then what you're doing is, in my mind, is really turning this upside down. Not only they're physically upside down, the chairs are rotating and they're upside down, suspended from the ceiling, but turning the history into the present, in that sense, upside down.
Yeah, and I think that's where the title Ghosts come from. Ghosts of the Museum, Ghosts of Ideas. And I sound kind of chair obsessed, but someone made some big decisions to choose that style of chair to be made that way. It wasn't a flippant kind of conversation. And so the brass chairs, I think of them as, the outlines, they're see-through, they're ghosts, they're kind of there, but they're not there. They're light, but also heavy.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to move to an installation shot. So here are some of the suspended chairs. I'm going to go back to this, sorry. Here you can see some of the chairs hanging. There are 5 of them. And actually, we were trying to count how many chairs we have. So far, I counted 5. I don't know if there are any more, but then I was thinking, well, you made 5 plus 2 extras. So maybe we have 7. I don't know.
There's 7 at the Phillips.
7 of the, okay. And you know
Yeah.
better than me.
Yeah, I'm very aware of how many there are. They've been a labor.
And so we have the hanging chairs, but we also have 2 chairs on the landing that are motor. And here are your sketches.
I'm obviously better at making things than drawing things. But the 2 on the stairs, they're exactly the same shape as the ones hanging. They've just got some bosses to mount them on this motorized shaft. And kind of they turn like you would a globe, similar kind of framework that runs around there. You can see one above Vesela's left shoulder. And they turn as slow as I could get them to. So just a way of, like the 3D model where this was originally modeled, you can turn it through space. So these just turn through space. They show all the different kind of angles or facets you can look at the chair through. And then
Yeah.
I think definitely sorry, Vesela.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say the turning ones for me function in a way to kind of make people hope people will slow down and look at something that, and I'm sure people make a connection of, oh, that chair's there. I know there's one sitting on every landing where the docet normally sits. So just to hopefully be able to make a connection between the artwork and the museum, a really direct, tangible line.
And one thing that I should say, as we were installing, and again, Marley was on Zoom, there is a way you can adjust the speed of rotation. And we were playing with that. And then you really wanted to have the slowest possible motion. Because when you walk by, especially if you're in a hurry, you don't even notice, or you barely notice that something is moving. And it's kind of like, you're unsure, are you, imagining that it's moving? Or it's really moving. And then that's the moment when you do stop and look.
Yeah. And I think that's something that I've worked on a bit in previous works too. Like I've made big, loud, fast, that kind of work. And it's very easy to take in very quickly. I sometimes joke with my wife that I sometimes feel like I go through a museum on roller skates. I move quickly, I look at things, I feel like I engage very quickly. So if there's something that I have to wait for, that gives me a moment to pause. So I think making work that's slow makes for a pause.
Yeah. And here we are having some, again, in the middle of installation, where you see some of the chairs and also the piece in the middle. But Marley, do you want to talk about brass and how it's related to the railing of the stairwell? Because that's the brass you used in both works.
Yeah. So for me, brass is it's kind of horrible to work with. It melts at a similar temperature to the brazing. When you weld it, fumes come off it. Different batches will snap and bend differently, but there's a weight to it. There's it's shiny, it's pretty, it lasts forever or for a very long time. It's traditionally like in artwork, kind of a monumental, like a bronze or a bronze cast, slightly different chemical composition. Are the fine art casts that people get into. And so using this brass, and this is an industrial brass rod, it's 3/16, just brass rod that comes in 12-foot lengths. Using it to make something that will last and they're beautiful objects, even though, you can make anything out of brass and it looks nice.
And it's amazing how the sense of translucency, of flickerness, especially when we were installing in the morning, the light was incredible, and the reflection and the shadows.
Yeah.
that glitzy, shiny feeling was really wonderful. And you can even tell on some of the photos that the reflection from the skylights is very playful,
Yeah,
very playful, very playful.
yeah. It's the other thing about working with that sort of brass is to get the luster. When it originally comes, it's kind of greasy, raw metal. I make something out of it. I've got a big vat of citric acid, kind of food confectioner's acid that I dip it in, and it takes all the grease off. But then the horrible bit is then you have to polish it by hand. So all the chairs and every rod in that Morris Lewis referencing work has been hand polished.
And how many rods?
Which is 330 in that rod, in that one behind you.
Let's see, here's the sketch, and here's the painting, Morris Lewis 182, that
Yeah,
we're
and
talking to.
yeah, and I guess, the furthering the conversation about intersections, coming back to the museum and saying, I'd like to make work about your chairs, raises some eyebrows. So when I started looking through the collection, Morris Lewis was part of the Washington Color School. This painting's actually enormous. I'm sure a lot of people have seen it. It's a bit over 2 meters 20. But it's light. It's light. And, I kind of started thinking about these Morris Lewis work, the dripped kind of running work. There's him, I'm sure there's an expert that will know whether this is true or not. I kind of thought he was painting gravity or painting with gravity. And so I kind of like that idea of painting something intent, painting a physics concept. And so I, was drawn to that. And the work up there, the wall-mounted work, it's many, many brass rods that have been drilled and soldered into a bar, and it actually is motorized, so it oscillates just enough. I think moves about 2 millimeters, which is 1/32 of an inch. So again, one of those things, it's doing something, but you need to kind of up and see if you can see what it's doing. It makes a motor noise and you can see the motor moving, but the work itself, it's quite subtle the way it oscillates.
But it does hum.
Yeah, and that's what the original design was to make it hum. So I've been in many art history lectures where people talk about paintings as radiant and humming, and Rothko's often spoken about that way. That I don't know whether my glasses or my eyes, I don't really know what that means. So I thought I'd try and make something that to me would hum.
And there we go.
Yeah.
Okay. So I included some of the installation shots where we began unpacking and then trying to really rock mountain climbers hang things from the ceiling. I have to say that the prep for this work was very intense, and it took some time to actually consult you and structural engineers, to figure out the weight bearing from the stairwell, from the dome, and figure out technically how can we do this safely. And although the weight of chairs is very minimal, the weight bearing had to be secured. So there was a lot of back and forth in order to make sure that we could safely do this and the chair will not fall or hit anybody. So this is the beginning of the installation. If you have any comments, I'm just going to go through, but please, say, again, you were on the other side of the screen. We were just going with the computer and moving around so you can see us and give us instructions. But this is how we began. And this is, you could see that one of the preparators is wearing the belts or that I see in rock climbing.
Mhm.
And this was the first chair. So we started with the top. So there's, you want to say like a cable, and how did you work on that? A single cable with figuring out the distances between the chairs.
Yeah, so I was lucky enough to go to the Phillips. It would have been 2 years ago or a year and a half last time I was there, and got up on the roof and was able to go and take measurements. And before the cable cross was installed, and on that trip it was having conversations with the engineer in DC, you know, trying to just get this going. And so then coming back to Australia and making the chairs, and I had a consult with in our local town, there's an amazing children's circus. And the head rigger there is an incredible acrobat. And he actually came out to the studio, and we spent a couple of hours talking about how to safely do this and the best way to do this, and, you know, cables and swivels and lifting equipment and all that sort of stuff. And he put me in contact with a company that I could get the cables made, and they've all been tested. So they put on a big rack and stretch to make sure they can hold well above the weights needed. The trick was, though, I just had to make a heap at slightly different lengths, because there's always going to be variables in the installation. And not being able to be there was painful for me. But to send options, so, you know, it was really up to the install crew, which were fantastic, and a friend who acted as a studio liaison, a guy Calder, who's saved my butt over there. He's been really great to make the decision about which cable to use in which instance. And doing that via Zoom at 2 in the morning here was great.
It's amazing to me, and I say this all the time, and still it odd how simple and enlightening this feels, seeing the work, and how much work and how much time and energy went into it to get to this point.
Yeah.
Simplicity and lightness.
Yeah, I often kind of say that it's a huge amount of work for a one-line joke.
And here are some installation shots. I hope you it's really something you need to experience in person, because also everything is on motion. These are kinetic works, but the fact that the stairwell is a space that is a spiral that also involves movement gives another dimension to the experience that, you know, having stills is just not the same. So Marley, here we are in your studio in the PowerPoint and physically. So here is how you did it, and tell us a little more, more anecdotes, more engineering stuff.
Sure. So on the left-hand side is me packing things, you know, for a long sea freight or air freight. It ended up being.
And you built all the crates. You should say that. And we were so impressed.
You know, I was joking with Alec, one of the preparators there. You know, once being on that side of the museum, you know, it's nice to get a crate with handles. You know, it really makes your day. So I try and make things friendly for me, you know, if I was the one working in the museum. So try and make things easy to install, easy to get out of crates, try and make the crates nice and have rounded edges so you don't go home with splinters. And then on the right-hand side is me soldering all the brass rods into place. When I originally kind of designed this work and the original sketches, I was working on the full scale of the Morris Lewis work. And once I made a steel frame at the same dimension, it's enormous. It towered above me. It was incredibly heavy to start with. And then when I drilled the rod, this one's 2/3 the scale, which 2/3 the scale exactly of the Morris Lewis work, just incidentally works out to be exactly the same height as me, which was kind of a nice, happy accident. When I started drilling out this rod, I just drilled it in the density that I thought it should look at, not counting numbers. I didn't do a computer model of this one, so I didn't really know what I was going to get. And it ended up with hundreds of rods, which if I did the full size work, it would have been triple that. This one already weighs about 80 kilograms, which is a couple of 100 pounds. It's a hefty, when you put a heap of brass together, it gets heavy. And so I think the next slide, Vesela, is working.
Yes, there's more details.
Yeah, so on the far right is I've got a tiny little model making mill that I can clamp about 6 inches of, I can drill 6 inches at a time. And so then it was just put on a podcast and sit there and count the number of turns I do on each handle. So there's one to go up and down, one handle to go left and right, one to go in and out. And so I was just trying to keep a rhythm of 4 turns, 1, 2 turns, 1, all the way around, and then just do that for days. There's computer controlled machinery that could do it in minutes, but I lack the skills of being able to draw it in a computer. So to translate it to someone to get it drawn and then to make it, I just kind of went, I'll just sit down and do it manually.
You haven't had any assistance all this time, did you? Or you had?
I had someone draw the computer image. I have no idea how to do any of that fancy stuff. But the manufacturing of it and the making of all the work is just me. And unfortunately, the polishing is just me too.
Here we have chairs, right?
Yeah, so this is because brass is a material that when you heat it, it expands and contracts a lot. So everything needs to be held in position. And the way I figured out to do it was I can go through and fuse the brass together using a TIG welder, which just puts it melts the 2 rods just enough to hold them together. It's not strong enough to hold the chairs together by itself. When you TIG weld it, it gets quite brittle. And so once they were TIG welded together, they'll hold their shape, but if you drop them, they shatter. And so then each weld I'll go over each one and braze it, silver solder it with a material you'd often use in plumbing to hold copper pipes together. So I think for me too, it was one of the first, often when I make works, it's just a one-off. So it's the fun problem solving to figure out how to make it. This is one of the first series of works that I've made multiples of. So, the first chair was trying to figure it out. Second one was, trying to perfect a couple of things. Third one was, all right, I've kind of got this down. And then there was another 7. So it became a different sort of labor to what I'm kind of used to. It was borderline for me production. So that opened up some new issues with motivation.
Did you ever work with brass before?
Yeah, so I had a show a couple of years ago at my commercial gallery in Sydney. That was the first time I'd used brass rod, and that was a show that I was making about weirdly the Philadelphia Super Bowl riots. And so Super Bowl party, chose to use the brass rod there to make these public furniture objects that were in the images from Philadelphia that night. It's pretty wild. and then to take these kind of the ghosts of these objects and make them into something beautiful and shiny. So that was the first time I'd used the brass rod, and that was a pretty steep learning curve. And then, yeah, still trying to figure it out.
And this is your studio, or adjacent to your studio. Again, we have chairs, but there's some other stuff.
Yeah. So this is, when we moved out here, we got really lucky. We bought a property that has a little house on it, like we're out in the country. And then the studio used to be a seed inoculation factory. So they were bringing in soybeans, growing funguses, inoculating the soybean and reselling it. So when we got the place, it was a really big rundown shed, which I'm in one side of it now. I did the conversion. I think it's 9.5 or 10,000 square feet. So part of the shed, the one that we're looking at now, there used to be a bus parked in there, but my father and I built it into an apartment. So it's kind of a nice space now, which is also great because the shed itself is filthy. And so if I can keep part of the studio clean, it's nice to be able to put work in it. And to, you know, wrap things not on a dirt floor.
Yeah, this looks like a gallery.
And so this, yeah, well, you know, both my wife and I work in, you know, the art sector. So it was always going to look white and shiny. Yeah, and the work we're looking at now, this is some of the stuff that's going to the Embassy of Australia next week. The one in front of us, they're topographical maps of both DC, where we lived for a few years, and of Bethanga, where we live now. And that aspect, the Embassy show is kind of linking my personal kind of physical experience of being both DC and Bethanga. And, you know, I feel like where I'm living, where I'm being, does trickle into what I make and how I make things. You know, when we were living in DC, I had a studio that was a single car garage, unheated, down near the corner of First and U Street, Northwest. No running water, so I got really friendly with the local bars. But the experience of working in that space, and then we moved to Philadelphia and I had a different studio there. And then to hear, you know, the physical environment I'm working in changes the way I work, as I'm sure it does with most people.
But you return to the place where you came from, right?
Yeah, so this is I can't swear on this thing, but a strange story. We were living in Philadelphia and it was time for us to leave, and my wife I just follow her around the world, was looking for jobs, and she was looking in, you know, Chicago and LA and all these other places. And I came home from the studio one night and she said, "Would you like a gin and tonic?" And I said, "Sure, why? What's happening?" And there was a job at a regional gallery here to be the director. The twist is, though, it's where I went to high school. And so that's why I got a gin and tonic that night.
Only one?
And I can't remember, so probably not. And so, yeah, we moved back to the hometown, my hometown, which is, you know, something that I turned, I was 17 and left to university thinking I'd never come back. And then, you know, 20 years later, here we are.
Yeah. Which brings me to ask you something a little bit about your background. I didn't introduce you properly on purpose because I wanted you to talk a little bit about your trajectory from finishing school in Australia, coming here, returning, and this kind of desire not only to create problems in order to solve them, other fields do it too in a different ways, but this kind of drive to really use engineering skills, structural planning that not very many artists do. They often hire people to do that. That I think comes from, if I correctly remember, from your father and growing up in a certain way and being exposed to making things by hand that you expanded upon. Do you want to say a little bit about that? And then we can look at some other of your works.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, for starters, my father's going to be chuffed that he got a mention. So, hi, Dad. Yeah, and, you know, I can often kind of trace it to a childhood spent on building sites. My father was constantly, or my parents were constantly working on a house, and almost, it seemed to me, as soon as they'd finish that house, would live there whilst it was being built around us. So, you know, constant renovation. Then they'd move and do it again. So, you know, I think I spent my first kind of 16 years in unfinished houses. There was you know, like a child's birthday party, maybe my 8th birthday party, where my dad got all my friends around to lay a concrete slab, told everyone to bring gum boots, and we all, you know, it was great, but kind of child labor. And so there was always tools, there was always a shed. You know, I got into making things. You know, I used to like turning wood when I was a kid. And then going to art school, I went to probably a more conceptually based art school. I held on to making and used to hang out with an old technician who was a panel beater. So he kind of taught me how to weld, and I've just been trying to accumulate skills and obviously tools to be able to do things. And, you know, the more things the more options I have, the more options I have, I guess, you know.
And furniture seems like there's a lot of furniture, there are a lot of utilitarian objects that you like to play with them and bring something uncanny about them. Again, twist them around, confuse the perception of them or the meaning of them, turn them in different shape and form into something recognizable but kind of odd. And what I love about your work is humor. It's always there. It always brings me a smile when I look at it.
That's lovely. Thank you. And, you know, I can talk really quickly to the couple of works on the screen. So the one on my left is the first time I'd worked with the brass rods. These were small scale replicas of the street lamps from Philadelphia, which, if anyone's been in Philadelphia, they're sometimes climbed. So I remade these, and there's a fallen one and a standing one. The work on the right is a work that I made when I was living in Philly. And I made a series of work a couple of years ago that were really highly polished aluminium road signs. And my gallery liked them because they're very shiny and the size of paintings. And I got an email one year asking, you know, are you making any more? And they were one of the worst things to make. They were just very dusty and dirty. And so I made this machine that polished. That's all it did. It rocked backwards and forwards, and then it turned the copper plate, kept going. And so it took my role. I wanted the machines to take my job. And so sent this contraption to the gallery instead of some really polished road signs.
I'm going to quickly, I'm watching the time. We're going to see some of your earlier work and tell us a little bit more about.
Yep. Let's blaze through them. So this is the first brass. The things in the foreground are these large planter pots that were in front of City Hall in Philadelphia that were rolled on the night of the Super Bowl win. And then these are press images of, you know, the aftermath, which then I got made into these kind of lovely tapestries, which are they're kind of metallic and really dark blacks, and they're really they're hard to see in images, very tactile. You kind of want to wrap yourself in them. And there's some of those tapestries going to both the embassy and to Hempel in DC.
Yeah, I can't wait to see that.
Yeah. This one is definitely linked to the I was kind of talking about where I'm living, kind of trickles into my work. So we moved back to Albury. I was talking to some family friends, and they mentioned that they were biodynamic farmers, or previously were biodynamic farmers. And I was kind of, we were having a drink, and I was like, well, what is that? And they started explaining it to me, and I was amazed and fascinated and confused. And so made these works that illustrate biodynamic farming principles in a pseudo-scientific kind of setup. So they look like the machines you use to test things, whether it's an IKEA cushion or a laboratory technique. And so each one of these is a different biodynamic principle that runs and functions in the gallery.
Mhm. I love this.
This one is a big thing. It's about 3 tennis courts in size, like the game pickup sticks, 2x4s all bolted together. It's in a site in Sydney that, slightly contentiously was a dock that was then reclaimed, made into a park. But part of the deal was a casino was built, which a lot of people didn't like. So this sculpture functioned to, when you go inside it, it's like a big maze. It had a couple of apertures. One was looking towards the harbour, which it's a gorgeous site. So one aperture opened out onto the harbour, one framed the casino, and one framed some old housing that was being demolished. So again, it was a way of getting people to go into something and then directing or opening an outlook that they might not have originally gone into the space expecting to see.
So how long did this last, and it just collapsed, or?
No, so it was part of a festival. It took us a week to build, and it was up for 2 weeks, and then it was dismantled. And I wasn't in the country anymore. I had to go back to Philadelphia, but I was told much of it went to like theatre groups and artists to reuse. And this was another one of those amazing things that it got a structural engineer certification. It was about, luckily the festival was working with this engineer, and they, through a lot of conversations, we built it with no plans. There was, I think, 7 of us working for a week. And the engineer came in and, did the calculations, and through the festival's clever use of language and the way of talking about the work, it was deemed safe.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And we're almost there, Miguel. This is something I remember from the Hempel Gallery some years ago, the rockets.
Yep. This was a going out on a limb here with Hempel. They saw one of my shows. They asked me to do a show, and I said, sure, can I burn holes in your walls? And they said yes, which was great. So they're these turned kind of wall hangings. They're shiny and pretty, and then they have a rocket engine in them that is activated for, I think it's 7 seconds, and then at the end you're left with the wall hanging and drawings. So the fastest way I could figure out to do a wall drawing.
Something like this, we couldn't have done this at the museum. Not now, maybe in some time in the future.
One
day.
That was one of the works that I got really into flow charts, because we put it in a museum over here, and they said, you can't do it. And I said, well, why not? And they said, oh, because of the gases produced. And so we worked out all the air conditioning turnover rates and the ventilation flow speeds. And so when you go in with all those things and go, well, we can, the air conditioner will do it. They get to a point where they just kind of go, well, okay. Okay, last two work really quickly. My wife's laughing at me. The one on the left was a moped that is a geared down motor. It turns very slowly. It takes maybe about 40 minutes to do a burnout. Again, you can almost can't tell it's moving. You just see the back wheel just beeping. And then the one on the right was a work called big one-line joke, carries a brick up to the top, rolls it down the conveyor belts, does it again. I found out with that work that having the sound of something crashing down and absolute chaos, galleries and museums don't like it so much.
You're such a teaser.
Sounds like something bad's happening. Yeah. All right. Sorry that went so long.
And then I think there's some questions. So I'd like to stop sharing this PowerPoint and turn it to you, the wonderful studio that I'm sure many artists here are jealous of, the space and everything you have. Yeah. But Miguel, I will refer to you to some questions.
Yeah, so Marley, we have a question in the chat, knowing kind of your inspiration with furniture and specifically the chairs at the Phillips collection. Someone is asking if you've done any research into who FFW was and kind of what that furniture company was.
So I did do some, but I didn't get very far. A friend put me in contact with someone's dad who was a furniture maker. You know, if anyone knows anything, I would love to know more. You know, it was one of those research rabbit holes that I started going down and couldn't find any answers. I couldn't find any documentation. I'm sure there's some in the Phillips somewhere, but there is a lot of files and archives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We talked to some of the colleagues who've been here for a very long time and we hoped to find out something, but it was a dead end. So far, a dead end, but it's really interesting.
Yeah. So if someone's great aunt is FFW, please let us know.
I think we're gonna have to do a little bit more digging to see if we can figure out. Yeah. I'm sure finance has a receipt somewhere saved from 1986 of us paying for these shares.
Yeah.
So we have a question in the Q&A. Erica would like to know if you could say more about your obsession with chairs.
So I'm not really obsessed with chairs. I am obsessed with the Phillips chair and why it is. You know, it functions as a signal or as a marker of how I feel about the Phillips. You know, that it's, to me, it's like the keystone in an arch of my experience of the Phillips. So not generally obsessed with chairs, just for this project.
Just the chairs at the Phillips collection.
Yeah.
Emma, who is one of the educators at the Phillips collection, is asking, can you tell us a little more about the other art that you make, which we just saw? When you're not inspired by chairs, what typically influences your work?
So, and it sounds kind of naff, but I don't really have a better answer, is I normally try and make ideas. So, and you know, it is incredibly personal, you know, there's no super intellectual thing behind it. It's stuff that I'm interested in. So if I get interested in something, I end up making some work about it. So if I meet a weird biodynamic farmer, then there might be a work about biodynamic farming, or there might be a work about, I'm trying to think what else. You know, like it's just whatever's kind of in front of me and I'm interested in at the time, and I just kind of hope someone else will be interested in it too.
Yeah. We have a question here from Erica Harper. Erica says, what material have you found the most challenging, and which haven't you used yet that you still want to try?
Yeah. First thing is material that I've found the most challenging. Brass is rubbish. The way I'm working with it, it takes a lot, but it also gives a lot. As for materials I would like to try, I don't know. I'd like all of them. You know, and I think that's the part of a key thing to my practice too, of trying to find new things. So, you know, I didn't know you could TIG weld brass, but now I do. And then I'm like, what else can I TIG weld together? The more techniques and materials that open up, and hopefully it opens the doors to further new things. I don't even know what I don't know, but I'm keen to find out.
Yeah, that's really great. We have a question from Victoria, who is asking, when you're working with materials like metal for temporary pieces, is finding ways to reuse or new homes for the material after your project a complete part of your work?
Yeah, so the brass is an interesting one in that it's the way I kind of was working with this chairs. I'll just grab a handful of something.
Yeah.
There's many errors, and so all the offcuts I store, and I made a little foundry, and so I can melt it. So I melt this brass into simple objects. So I know in the Hemphill show over there, there's a ashtray, which was taken inspiration from an image from the Phillips collection. You used to be able to smoke in the galleries, which is odd to us now. But there's these floor standing ashtrays that were quite beautiful. So I've cast one of those out of the offcuts and the errors. So try and kind of cycle it through like that, you know, melt things down to remake things. Yeah, I hope that answers.
Yeah. So similar to the like 2x4s that were used in that like public art piece, are your offcuts or your scrap wood or whatever ever given to other artists or other creatives?
To be honest, at the moment, I kind of reuse, because we're out in the country and I've got this, I joke that it's an apocalypse studio, that I just fill it full of things and I never have to leave. So not much has been going, but yeah, I think I kind of keep reusing stuff till it's in the ground normally. You know, when it's that big project, I did one of those big constructions in Perth,
Yeah.
Western Australia, and that went to a theatre company. I did one in DC quite a few years ago, which was bright green wood, and that was given to the neighbour who pulled the work down and dispersed it. And I still get conversations with a friend in DC saying, I saw another pickup truck with a wooden rack on the back made of that green wood. So, you know, it's like how people put a stamp on a dollar note and see where it goes through the world. Seeing this, if anyone sees bright green, it was 3 by 1.5 wood. It like chroma key green. I think there's a deck made of it somewhere in the Northeast.
Well, if we can keep your crates and return your work or not return your work, and keep your crates, who would be very grateful.
They're nice crates.
They're wonderful. They're a work of art too. But I want to say 2 of the ashtrays, but not the freestanding one, but the small one that you sent are in our shop. So to promote our shop, so if anybody is interested,
yeah,
shop.
They're very heavy.
I'm sure they are. So we have another question here from somebody named Jill, and she says, I love the fact that your sculptures are ghosts of the chairs, also have a distinct relationship to the sculpture about the painting. Can you talk more about the relationship to one another?
So I think the most direct connection, there's two connections between those works. One is they're both part of the Phillips, and I'm trying to give them both equal weighting between this, revered kind of painting and also the chairs that you put your butt on. So trying to put them on the same level, and then a material one. So they're both made of mainly of brass, and then the turning chairs and the frame of the Morris Lewis work are both galvanized steel. So it's a material connection that they're made from the same stuff. And I think that's kind of an idea that, between the chairs, which are, probably not as well looked after as the Morris Lewis work, but they're kind of made from the same thing. They're made of wood and fabric. And just kind of looking at the kind of weight that we bestow on objects.
Yeah. So as we are past 7 p.m. here in Washington, D.C., we have one more question before we let you go for tonight. Erica asked, rocket engines and burnouts, how does that fit into your work?
So that is always a learning curve. So the burnouts it's funny because it's not dramatic. It's not a burnout. It takes the show out of a burnout. It does the mechanics, it does the physics, but it takes 40 minutes to do one lap. There's no smoke, there's no noise, it's still doing a burnout. And I think that was in a response to making work, when I was younger, that was loud and big and, showy. And then looking at that through a lens of how do I making it as a guy and not wanting to be, a dude, and then how to still make work that I find interesting without making it duty. And the rocket engines were something I was interested in. Moved to DC, started going to the Air and Space Museums. The forms are actually modeled after some stuff that was out in the Dulles. The original forms, they were used to test aerodynamics. They had computer models or ideas of how things work, but someone would turn these wooden forms and put them in a wind tunnel. Like that's how things were tested with their hands and, kind of on the ground. So that's where the rockets came from, of me nerding out at museums.
That's really wonderful. I think those are all the questions we have for you tonight from the audience. I think Vesela has one more.
There was one question that I saw about the weight of the chair, and I wanted to say something about it. It's very, very little. It's about 5 kilos or 7 kilos, or let's say 10 pounds, something like that. Correct, Marley? Yeah.
They're 10 kilos, so yes, 16 or 18 pounds. 2 gallons of paint. That's how I translated it.
And that really came as a surprise seeing them in person, and especially when they're suspended, they're really truly see-through. And when there is light coming through the dome, to skylight, you literally see through. And that's incredible, even though you kind of expect one thing, you expected them to be light, but that kind of translucency was something that was really new seeing it in person. And once again, I wish we were here in person. All the intersections used to be in person, and now at this point we would go out and cheers, chin chin to the artist and keep it really improvisational and spontaneous. At this point, I hope you will be able to join us in person sometime before September. But I want to thank everybody, especially you, Marley. We really missed you. This has been an incredible adventure for so many of us here, and one for me personally, most delightful installation. So cheers to Marley. And thank you.
Thank you very much for everyone.
Night.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.